Hello. Settle in comfortably, wrap yourself up warmly, and let the gentle whisper of stories carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Imagine the bustling streets of late 19th century America, a nation rapidly industrializing, yet simultaneously grappling with myriad social ills. At the heart of many perceived problems, from poverty and crime to domestic violence, lay a pervasive culprit in the public imagination: alcohol. This wasn't merely social commentary. It was a deeply ingrained conviction that fueled one of the most ambitious and ultimately disastrous social experiments in American history: Prohibition. The seeds of this dry thirst were sown decades earlier, burgeoning from religious revivalism and the burgeoning women's suffrage movement. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, founded in 1874, became formidable forces. Under the leadership of figures like Frances Willard, the WCTU advocated for total abstinence, framing alcohol as a moral poison destroying the sanctity of the home. Their efforts were relentless, employing petitions, lectures, and even hatchet-wielding crusades like those led by Carrie Nation, who famously attacked saloons with an almost religious zeal. By the turn of the 20th century, the anti-saloon sentiment had considerable traction. The Anti-Saloon League, established in 1893, masterfully shifted the focus from individual moral failing to the systemic evils of the liquor industry. They employed sophisticated lobbying tactics, focusing on single-issue politics and supporting dry candidates regardless of their party affiliation. Their research, often meticulously compiled, painted a grim picture. A 1910 study, for instance, indicated that approximately 73% of pauperism in urban areas was directly attributable to intemperance. While the methodology of such studies might be scrutinized today, they held significant sway with a public predisposed to identifying alcohol as a societal ill. The movement gained further momentum during World War I. Prohibitionists argued that banning alcohol would conserve grain for wartime food production and improve the moral and physical fitness of soldiers. This patriotic narrative, coupled with anti-German sentiment that targeted German-American brewers, provided the final push. In 1917, Congress proposed the 18th Amendment, and by January 16, 1919, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify it, officially making prohibition the law of the land. The Volstead Act, passed subsequently in October 1919, defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, effectively closing all breweries, distilleries, and saloons, and making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal. The noble experiment was born not from arbitrary whim, but from decades of fervent activism, strategic political maneuvering, and a deep-seated belief that by eliminating alcohol, America could purify its soul and uplift its citizens. This was the first sip of forbidden fruit, a nation's ambitious attempt to legislate morality, unaware of the Pandora's box it was about to open. The ink was barely dry on the Volstead Act, yet the illusion of a dry America began to crack almost immediately. Despite the fervent hopes of reformers who believed consumption would plummet, the demand for alcohol, far from disappearing, simply transformed, retreating into the shadows where an illicit industry was already beginning to flourish. The enforcement arm of Prohibition, the Bureau of Prohibition, was woefully understaffed and underfunded from the outset. With barely 1,500 agents initially tasked with policing a nation of over 100 million people and countless miles of porous borders and coastlines, the task was Herculean, if not impossible. Customs and law enforcement officials, often poorly paid, were highly susceptible to bribery, further hamstringing effective enforcement. This created an immediate vacuum, quickly filled by those willing to risk fines and imprisonment for substantial profit. Almost overnight, the landscape of alcohol production and distribution shifted dramatically. Home brewing and distilling became widespread. Recipes for bathtub gin and hooch circulated surreptitiously, often leading to concoctions that were not only vile tasting, but potentially lethal due to impurities or the toxic ingredients sometimes used to mimic alcohol. Simultaneously, industrial alcohol, intended for legitimate commercial purposes, was diverted in massive quantities. Denatured alcohol, for example, contained poisons to render it undrinkable, but resourceful bootleggers found ways to renature it, sometimes imperfectly, leading to blindness, paralysis, or even death for consumers. The Canadian and Mexican borders, along with the extensive coastline, became vital arteries for rum running and bootlegging operations. Smugglers, often operating under the cloak of darkness and utilizing high-speed boats, brought in Canadian whiskey and West Indies rum. In cities like Detroit, located directly across the river from Windsor, Ontario, an estimated 75% of illegal liquor entering the United States was ferried across the Detroit River. This vibrant cross-border trade alone highlights the sheer scale of the illicit market. As this black market expanded, it quickly outgrew individual entrepreneurs. The immense profits to be made, a bottle of illegal whiskey could fetch 10 times its pre-prohibition cost, attracted organized criminal elements. Gangs, already established in various rackets, saw an unprecedented opportunity. This marked the birth of a new era of organized crime, one that would redefine the American underworld. The stage was set for figures like Al Capone to rise from obscurity, not just as criminals, but as powerful, often untouchable, magnates of the illegal alcohol empire. Prohibition, designed to curb vice, was paradoxically laying the groundwork for its exponential growth and professionalization. As illicit alcohol flowed, so too did venues for its consumption. The traditional saloon, once a public and often rowdy fixture, was replaced by a more clandestine, yet often far more sophisticated establishment, the speakeasy. These hidden havens for drinking quickly became cultural touchstones of the Prohibition era, reflecting both the ingenuity of a thirsty public and the growing reach of organized crime. Speakeasies ranged from grimy, backroom operations in derelict buildings to lavish, meticulously decorated underground clubs. Access was typically by whispered password or a secret knock, reinforcing the illicit thrill. In New York City alone, estimates suggested there were between 20,000 to 100,000 speakeasies by the mid-1920s, a staggering increase from the approximately 15,000 legal saloons that existed before Prohibition. This explosion demonstrates not a reduction in drinking, but rather its relocation and metamorphosis. These establishments offered more than just illegal beverages. Many, particularly in urban centers, became cultural melting pots, pioneering trends in music, dance, and fashion. Harlem's Cotton Club, for example, though not exclusively a speakeasy, was a quintessential example of an establishment that flourished during this era, showcasing jazz legends to mixed audiences. The atmosphere was often one of liberation, particularly for women, who found respectability in these spaces that was often denied in pre-prohibition saloons. Alcohol consumption became a powerful symbol of modernity and rebellion against puritanical norms. Yet, beneath the veneer of gaiety lay a constant undercurrent of anxiety. The legality of speakeasies was precarious, and raids by federal agents or local police were a constant threat. Owners and patrons lived with the fear of arrest, fines, or public humiliation. The quality and safety of alcohol were also major concerns. While some establishments might serve smuggled high-quality liquor, many relied on locally manufactured bathtub gin or diluted industrial alcohol. This potentially toxic brew led to countless cases of poisoning, blindness, and even death. The National Institutes of Health estimates that by 1929, an estimated 50,000 people had died from drinking adulterated alcohol during Prohibition. The inherent illegality of speakeasies also linked them inextricably to organized crime. Gangsters who controlled the supply of alcohol often owned or controlled the speakeasies themselves, extending their power and influence deeper into the social fabric. This dynamic transformed formerly legitimate businesses into fronts for criminal enterprises, further entrenching the mob's hold on American society. The speakeasy, therefore, stood as a vibrant yet dangerous paradox, a symbol of both cultural liberation and the corrupting failures of a nationwide ban. The cultural upheaval of Prohibition extended far beyond the clandestine glow of speakeasies. It permeated the very fabric of society, quite literally influencing fashion and challenging traditional gender roles. Amidst the swirling smoke and forbidden sips, a new archetype emerged, the flapper, whose very style epitomized defiance against the restrictive norms that Prohibition sought to enforce. Before Prohibition, women's fashion was largely conservative, characterized by corsets, long skirts, and often confined silhouettes. The flapper, however, ushered in an era of unprecedented liberation. Skirts dramatically shortened, revealing ankles and even knees, a stark contrast to the ankle-length dresses of previous decades. Waistlines dropped, creating a looser, more boyish silhouette that eschewed the hourglass figure. Bobbed hair, often covered by cloche hats, replaced long, elaborate coiffures. This radical shift was not merely aesthetic, it was deeply symbolic. The clothes were designed for movement, for dancing the Charleston, for quick escapes from a raided speakeasy, for a more active, independent lifestyle. The flapper's attire gave her a freedom of movement that reflected her newfound social freedoms. They smoked, they drank, often in public, or at least in semi-public speakeasies. They drove cars, and they openly challenged Victorian ideals of femininity. This was a generation rejecting the moralizing tone championed by many Prohibition advocates. Cosmetics, once associated with theatrical performers or women of ill repute, became mainstream. Dark lipstick, kohl-rimmed eyes, and powdered faces were all part of the flapper's alluring, rebellious persona. The image conveyed was one of sophistication, daring, and an overt rejection of the good girl image championed by temperance movements. The flapper represented a woman who was economically more independent, often working outside the home, and financially capable of indulging in the new era's pleasures. The flapper also played a significant role in changing social dynamics within the speakeasy. Prior to Prohibition, saloons were predominantly male domains. Speakeasies, by their illegal and secretive nature, became more inclusive spaces. The presence of flappers and other modern women normalized mixed-gender socializing in ways the pre-Prohibition era never condoned. This new social landscape fostered romantic interactions and relationships outside the watchful eyes of conservative society, contributing to a broader cultural loosening that was directly intertwined with the era's illicit activities. The flapper, with her bobbed hair and defiant spirit, became an unintentional icon against the dry movement, embodying a generation's pursuit of freedom and self-expression amidst the nation's grand but failing experiment. The crackdown on legitimate alcohol production did not extinguish America's thirst. Instead, it ignited an unexpected wave of innovation born of desperation. Deprived of commercial breweries and distilleries, ordinary citizens and burgeoning criminal enterprises alike turned their homes and hidden workshops into clandestine factories, giving rise to an array of homemade and often dangerous alcoholic beverages, the most infamous being bathtub gin. Bathtub gin wasn't just a colourful phrase. It described a crude, homemade liquor, often concocted in bathtubs or other large containers, in apartments, basements, and rural shacks. The process involved mixing cheap grain alcohol with flavourings like juniper extract, glycerin, and other additives to mimic the taste of gin. The use of denatured industrial alcohol, which was readily available for legitimate industrial use, was a common and terrifying shortcut. This alcohol contained methanol, a highly toxic substance added by the government to prevent its consumption. When bootleggers attempted to renature it, they often failed to remove all the methanol, leading to severe illness, blindness, and even death for consumers. Between 1920 and 1930, an estimated 10,000 Americans died from inadvertently consuming denatured alcohol. This period also saw a surge in amateur distilling. Moonshiners, once primarily associated with remote Appalachian regions, became a national phenomenon. Small, portable stills, constructed from copper tubing, pressure cookers, and even discarded car radiators, popped up across the country. These crude stills, often operated by novices, frequently produce liquor of inconsistent quality and purity, sometimes containing harmful impurities like lead from soldered joints. Recipes circulated by word of mouth or in clandestine pamphlets, encouraging experimentation that often prioritized potency over safety. Beyond gin, other homemade concoctions flourished. Rye was often just colored and flavored grain alcohol. Homemade wine, fruit brandies, and beer, though less potent, became commonplace. Families that had never brewed before suddenly found themselves fermenting grapes in their cellars, often with the tacit understanding or even open encouragement of their communities. The sheer creativity and resourcefulness of a nation determined to drink, despite federal law, was astounding. These desperate innovations highlight a critical failure of prohibition. Rather than eliminate alcohol consumption, it decentralized and deregulated it. Quality control vanished, replaced by the immediate dangers of uncontrolled production. The metallic taste of bathtub gin and the burn of unregulated moonshine became hallmarks of an era where a simple drink could represent not just a transgressive pleasure, but a gamble with one's health, all thanks to a law intended, ironically, to improve public welfare. Beneath the jazz-infused revelry and the clinking of illicit glasses, a pervasive tension permeated the speakeasies and clandestine operations of the Prohibition era. Every secret knock, every whispered password, carried an unspoken understanding. The party could end at any moment with the sudden, bitter chill of a raid. These crackdowns, often conducted with theatrical flair, were a defining yet ultimately futile aspect of the Prohibition narrative. Federal agents, or Prohibition agents, colloquially known as revenuers, along with local police forces, were tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act. Their methods often involved undercover surveillance, informants, and sometimes outright deception to gain entry into suspected speakeasies. Once inside, the scene was often chaotic. Agents would smash bottles, pour liquor into sewers, dismantle stills, and arrest patrons and owners alike. Newsreels and newspaper photographs frequently sensationalize these raids, showing agents triumphantly destroying kegs of beer or smashing cases of bottled spirits, attempting to project an image of law and order triumphing over illicit indulgence. However, the reality of enforcement was far more complex and often ineffective. As mentioned previously, the Bureau of Prohibition was severely understaffed and underfunded. At its peak, the force consisted of only around 3,000 agents nationwide, a wholly insufficient number to police an entire nation's drinking habits. Moreover, corruption was rampant. Many agents and local law enforcement officials were paid off by bootleggers and speakeasy owners, allowing operations to continue unhindered. In some cases, a raid might simply be a public show, designed to satisfy public outcry, or to target a competitor on behalf of a bribing criminal enterprise, rather than a genuine attempt to halt alcohol sales. The consequences for those caught were varied. Patrons might face fines or a night in jail, often more of a public embarrassment than a severe legal penalty. Speakeasy owners and bootleggers, however, faced more serious charges, including prison sentences and substantial fines. Yet the black market was so lucrative that these risks were often considered a cost of doing business. The economic incentives for operating outside the law far outweighed the risks of occasional raids. Indeed, the raids themselves often served inadvertently to fuel the allure of the forbidden. The thrill of narrowly escaping an arrest or the shared experience of witnessing a raid only deepened the sense of camaraderie among the defiant drinkers. In the broader context, these theatrical displays of enforcement did little to stem the tide of illicit alcohol. They merely underscored the inherent difficulty and ultimate impracticality of enforcing a law that a significant portion of the population actively resisted. Each sudden silence of a good time was quickly followed by the emergence of another, perpetuating the cycle of defiance and selective enforcement that characterized prohibition. While the speakeasy emerged as the vibrant symbol of everyday defiance, the social upheaval of prohibition also impacted more established, exclusive institutions. The venerable gentlemen's clubs, once bastions of refined male camaraderie and quiet indulgence, found themselves navigating a suddenly dry landscape, their traditions and privileges challenged by the very law intended to uplift society. Before the 18th Amendment, gentlemen's clubs in major cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were sanctuaries for the well-to-do. Here, members could enjoy fine cigars, discreet conversations, elaborate meals, and, critically, an extensive selection of the finest wines, whiskies, and brandies. These establishments served as extensions of members' homes and offices, vital for social networking, business deals, and simply unwinding in an atmosphere of exclusivity and discretion. The prohibition on alcohol, however, fundamentally threatened their very operational model. Initially, many clubs attempted to uphold the letter of the law, removing their liquor cellars and serving non-alcoholic beverages. However, the demand for alcohol among their affluent members remained undiminished. These clubs quickly adapted, often becoming early examples of private speakeasies. Members, by virtue of their social standing and connections, could often secure their own supply of illicit alcohol, which was then consumed discreetly within the club's walls. Some clubs developed elaborate systems for storing and serving liquor, sometimes even having secret compartments or hidden dumbwaiters to ferry drinks to private rooms, meticulously avoiding overt displays that might attract attention from authorities. The adaptation, however, was not without its complexities. The very act of engaging in illegal activities, no matter how discreet, ran counter to the respectable, law-abiding image these institutions cultivated. It placed their esteemed members, often prominent figures in law, business, and politics, in a compromising position. While a raid on a working-class speakeasy might generate headlines and public scorn for the patrons, a similar incident at a prestigious gentleman's club could have far-reaching political and social repercussions, often resulting in hushed settlements rather than public prosecutions. The shift also subtly altered the club's internal dynamics. The camaraderie that once flowed freely with legitimate alcohol now carried an undercurrent of shared illegality, a conspiratorial bond forged in the consumption of forbidden fruit. Furthermore, the source of their liquor often tied them, however indirectly, to the burgeoning criminal underworld. While members might distance themselves from the rougher elements of bootlegging, their continued demand for high-quality spirits meant they were, by proxy, contributing to the financial power of organized crime. Prohibition thus forced even the most elite segments of society to compromise their ideals, demonstrating how deeply the law permeated and often corrupted diverse layers of American life. Prohibition's proponents had championed the dry law as a moral imperative, an antidote to the social ills they believed were destroying the American family. They argued that banning alcohol would safeguard homes from the devastating effects of intemperance, leading to less domestic violence, greater financial stability for families, and stronger moral foundations. Yet, the reality that unfolded within the domestic sphere was far more complex, often revealing new stresses and unexpected disruptions to the very sanctity of the home it aimed to protect. While there is some evidence of an initial decrease in arrests for public drunkenness, and, anecdotally, a reduction in alcohol-related domestic violence in some areas shortly after the Volstead Act, these gains were often short-lived and overshadowed by unforeseen consequences. One significant shift was the relocation of drinking from public saloons to private homes. The saloon, once a male-dominated public space, was replaced by home consumption. This meant that for women and children who sought refuge from alcoholic spouses, the problem was no longer confined to outside the home, but brought directly within its walls, making escape more difficult. Furthermore, the domestic production of alcohol, born out of necessity and a desire to circumvent the law, introduced new dangers into homes. The practice of brewing beer, making wine, and above all, distilling spirits in residential settings, often in kitchens, basements, or even bathrooms, brought highly flammable and toxic chemicals into close contact with families. Incidents of fires caused by faulty stills or poisoning from improperly purified liquor became grim realities of the era. The very act of engaging in these illegal activities also placed families, sometimes unwillingly, in direct violation of federal law, fostering a broader disrespect for the law itself within the household. Consider the economic impact. While some families might have benefited from reduced spending on alcohol, many working-class households faced new financial pressures. The cost of illicit alcohol was significantly higher than legal beverages, forcing some to spend disproportionate amounts of their income to sustain drinking habits. This could funnel money away from essential needs like food, clothing, and housing, thereby exacerbating the very poverty that prohibition was meant to alleviate. For families involved in bootlegging or home production, the lure of quick, albeit illegal, money could draw individuals into criminal enterprises, potentially leading to arrests, imprisonment, and further hardship for their dependents. Prohibition, therefore, did not uniformly heal the cracks in the American home. In many instances, it merely shifted the location and nature of the problems. The echo of a seemingly broken bottle, once a public nuisance, transformed into a private tragedy, revealing the profound limits of legislating morality and the unexpected ways in which an external law could subtly yet significantly unravel the fabric of domestic life, replacing one set of problems with another, arguably more insidious, collection. Prohibition was intended to cleanse society, but instead, it inadvertently fertilized the ground for the unprecedented growth of organized crime. The vacuum left by legitimate alcohol producers was swiftly filled by criminal elements, whose operations scaled from small-time bootlegging to sprawling, violent empires. The roar of a Tommy gun became the terrifying soundtrack of this new gangland era. Prior to the Volstead Act, organized crime existed, but it was largely fragmented and focused on gambling, prostitution, and petty rackets. Prohibition offered an entirely new, incredibly lucrative commodity. Demand for alcohol was insatiable, and the profits to be made from its illegal supply were astronomical. A gallon of raw industrial alcohol could be purchased for 40 cents, and once redistilled and diluted, sold as whiskey for as much as $10 at a speakeasy. This profit margin provided an unparalleled financial foundation for criminal gangs, transforming them into powerful enterprises. Cities like Chicago became epicenters of this new criminal power. Al Capone, perhaps the most infamous figure of the era, epitomized the rise of the gangland boss. From humble beginnings, Capone leveraged intimidation, violence, and shrewd business acumen to establish an empire estimated to generate over $100 million annually by the mid-1920s, equivalent to billions today. His organization, known as the Chicago Outfit, controlled a vast network of breweries, distilleries, speakeasies, and transportation routes, effectively monopolizing the illegal liquor trade in the city and beyond. The immense wealth concentrated in the hands of these gangsters allowed them to operate with near impunity. They systematically corrupted law enforcement officials, judges, and politicians through bribery, ensuring their operations largely remained unmolested. Those who couldn't be bought were often intimidated or eliminated. The violence escalated dramatically as rival gangs fought for control of lucrative territories and supply lines. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, in which 7 members of Bugs Moran's North Side gang were brutally murdered by Capone's men, served as a chilling testament to the ruthlessness of these turf wars and the shocking level of public violence. This era marked a profound shift in the nature of American crime. Organized crime moved beyond fragmented, localized operations to become sophisticated, hierarchical organizations with vast resources and political influence. They diversified into other rackets, using their prohibition-fueled wealth to expand into gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Prohibition, far from making America safer, had inadvertently created a generation of powerful, wealthy, and violent criminal enterprises, fundamentally altering the landscape of crime and law enforcement for decades to come. The noble experiment had directly ushered in the reign of the gangster. The immense profits generated by the illegal alcohol trade fueled not only organized crime's expansion, but also a perilous, high-stakes logistical challenge, getting the forbidden fruit from source to thirsty consumer. This intricate network of illicit supply lines was maintained by a specialized, daring class of individuals known as bootleggers, whose dangerous deliveries often left the squeal of tires on cobblestones echoing through the night. Bootlegging was far more sophisticated than simply carrying a flask. It encompassed a vast, multifaceted transportation system. Raw alcohol, often from Canada or Mexico, or secretly distilled within the US, needed to be moved across national borders, state lines, and through bustling urban centers without detection. This required an impressive degree of coordination, secrecy, and often technological adaptation. Customized vehicles became central to the bootlegging enterprise. Ordinary-looking cars and trucks were modified with reinforced suspensions, hidden compartments, and souped-up engines to outrun law enforcement. These rum runners vehicles were designed for speed and cargo capacity, turning common automobiles into essential tools of the criminal trade. Legendary bootleggers and professional drivers, often with roots in the emerging sport of stock car racing, honed their skills dodging revenue agents on winding rural roads and navigating the dark alleyways of cities. These chases, often at breakneck speeds, were common occurrences, turning stretches of highway into arenas for deadly cat and mouse games. Beyond land routes, significant amounts of alcohol arrived by sea and air. Maritime rum runners operated within a narrow band of international waters, just outside the reach of US prohibition laws, known as Rum Row. From there, smaller, faster contact boats would ferry the liquor ashore under the cover of darkness. In some instances, even early aviators were employed to fly in high-value shipments, capitalizing on the nascent and less regulated nature of air travel. The dangers were manifold. Beyond the constant threat of arrest and imprisonment, bootleggers risked encounters with rival gangs vying for control of lucrative territories. Betrayal, ambush, and fierce gunfights were common, marking the delivery routes with violence and death. The stakes were incredibly high. A single successful run could mean significant personal wealth, but a capture or ambush could mean ruin or worse. The bootlegging phenomenon transformed how goods were transported under duress and fostered a culture of daring ingenuity, albeit in the service of illegal commerce. It also revealed the glaring limitations of the prohibition enforcement strategy. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, the sheer demand for alcohol and the vast profits kept the wheels of these illicit supply chains turning. The squealing tires and the desperate dash of bootleggers underscored a crucial flaw. As long as there was a market, there would be determined individuals willing to risk everything to supply it, effectively rendering the laws of prohibition a largely symbolic gesture against an unquenchable national thirst. Amidst the clandestine glamour of speakeasies and the daring exploits of bootleggers, prohibition harbored a truly sinister side: the deliberate poisoning of industrial alcohol. What began as a misguided attempt by the government to deter illicit drinking escalated into a policy that caused untold suffering and thousands of deaths, leaving a stinging burn far more agonizing than any illicit drink. Industrial alcohol, also known as denatured alcohol, was a perfectly legal commodity, essential for a myriad of industrial processes from manufacturing to embalming. To prevent its diversion for drinking, the federal government had, since 1906, mandated the addition of toxic denaturants, making it unpalatable and dangerous. With the passage of prohibition and the subsequent surge in alcohol smuggling and bootlegging, the government's response was not to reconsider the policy, but to intensify it. Under Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's direction, the federal government authorized a drastic increase in the types and quantities of poisons added to industrial alcohol. Methanol, also known as wood alcohol, was a particularly potent additive. Even small amounts of methanol can cause blindness, organ damage, and death. Other denaturants included kerosene, benzene, iodine, zinc, and even paralyzing drugs. The aim was explicitly to make redistilling or renaturing the alcohol so toxic that consumption would be too dangerous to be worthwhile. Dr. Charles Norris, New York City's chief medical examiner during Prohibition, famously described the government's policy as our national experiment in cadaver making. Bootleggers, driven by the immense profits, developed illicit processes to remove or neutralize these poisons. However, their methods were often imperfect, leaving behind hazardous contaminants. Consumers, desperate for a drink and often unaware of the provenance of their liquor, became the unwitting victims. Hospitals reported a dramatic increase in cases of methanol poisoning, often manifesting as sudden blindness, paralysis, and excruciating pain before death. Statistics paint a grim picture. Between 1920 and 1933, an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 Americans died from poisonous bootleg alcohol, with a significant percentage attributed directly to the government's denaturing program. In New York City alone, Norris reported nearly 700 deaths from alcoholic poisoning in 1926. This tragic chapter reveals a dark paradox of prohibition. The very government tasked with protecting its citizens inadvertently became an agent of harm. The policy of poisoning industrial alcohol wasn't just a regulatory measure. It was a deliberate and deadly deterrent, a stark manifestation of the moral absolutism that underpinned the noble experiment. The stinging burn of industrial alcohol became a horrific symbol of Prohibition's disastrous human cost, etched indelibly into the nation's memory, not just by taste, but by suffering and death. Beyond the catastrophic deaths from poisoned alcohol and the rise of gangland empires, Prohibition inflicted another, quieter but pervasive harm: the erosion of personal liberty and the unjust punishment of ordinary citizens. While the public imagination often focuses on kingpins like Al Capone, the reality is that countless common Americans found themselves facing the shivering cold of a jail cell for actions that, a few years prior, had been perfectly legal and socially acceptable. The sheer breadth of the Volstead Act meant that almost anyone involved in the production, sale, or transportation of alcohol, no matter how small scale, was in violation of federal law. This included the home brewer making beer for personal consumption, the small-time bootlegger ferrying a few bottles, or even individuals caught in a speakeasy. The federal court system quickly became overwhelmed. Between 1920 and 1930, federal prosecutions for prohibition violations soared from 17,992 to an astonishing 72,987 annually. This constituted a massive increase in the federal caseload, diverting resources from other areas of law enforcement and justice. The impact was disproportionately felt by working-class and immigrant communities, who often lacked the resources or political connections to navigate the legal system. For these groups, a conviction, even for a minor offense, could mean significant fines, loss of livelihood, or imprisonment, affecting entire families. The spectacle of wealthy individuals frequenting lavish speakeasies with little consequence, while a poor man might be jailed for brewing bathtub gin in his tenement, underscored a growing sense of hypocrisy and injustice. This created a profound disillusionment with the system and fostered a widespread disregard for the law. Furthermore, the methods used to enforce prohibition often infringed upon civil liberties. Extensive surveillance, wiretapping, and warrantless searches became commonplace as agents struggled to gather evidence. The increased power granted to law enforcement led to instances of agent misconduct, brutality, and corruption. The very act of consuming alcohol was deemed immoral and criminal, leading to public shaming and arbitrary enforcement that often felt more like moral crusading than objective justice. The common man's experience with prohibition was rarely glamorous. It was a life lived under the shadow of potential arrest for what many considered harmless pleasure, a constant negotiation with an arbitrary and often corrupt legal system. The moral high ground claimed by prohibition's proponents was undermined by the visible inequities of its enforcement. For many, the noble experiment primarily served to turn ordinary citizens into criminals, filling jails and tarnishing lives, all in pursuit of an unattainable moral purity that ultimately served only to breed resentment and further erode respect for the rule of law. While urban centers bustled with secretive speakeasies and dangerous street-level bootlegging, the American countryside became another unexpected front in the Prohibition War. Far from the glaring lights of the cities, hidden deep within barns, cellars, and remote outbuildings, the sweet aroma of unsanctioned breweries and distilleries mingled with the scent of hay and manure, transforming countless farmhouses into clandestine centers of alcohol production. The agricultural sector, already grappling with economic challenges, experienced a dramatic shift under Prohibition. Farmers, facing plummeting grain prices and financial instability, found an unexpected lifeline in the illicit liquor trade. Corn, rye, and barley, once destined for legitimate markets, now fetched handsome prices when converted into potent alcohol. This shift was particularly pronounced in regions with a history of moonshining, like the Appalachians, where the art of distillation had been passed down through generations. However, this ancient practice now spread across the nation, driven by unprecedented demand and lucrative returns. These farmhouse operations range from rudimentary stills capable of producing a few gallons of white lightning a day to much larger, sophisticated setups with hidden pipelines and elaborate concealment mechanisms, producing thousands of gallons weekly. One common tactic was to disguise stills within barns or sheds, sometimes even camouflaging delivery trucks as legitimate farm vehicles to transport the finished product. The sheer scale of rural production was enormous, feeding both local demand and the larger criminal syndicates that distributed alcohol to urban speakeasies across the country. Consider the farmer, John Doe, a composite based on historical accounts, who might use a secret trapdoor in his barn to reveal a fully operational distillery below. While his wife sold eggs and milk at the market, he was overseeing the production of hundreds of gallons of illegal whiskey, a stark necessity to keep his family farm afloat. This widespread involvement of ordinary citizens, not hardened criminals, but desperate farmers, challenged the very notion of who a lawbreaker was. Many viewed their actions as economic survival rather than criminal defiance, seeing themselves as providing a public good to thirsty consumers and an economic benefit to struggling rural communities. This emergence of farmhouse breweries and distilleries further underscored the inherent difficulty of enforcing prohibition. The vast, decentralized nature of rural production made it incredibly challenging for the limited number of federal agents to suppress. Raids in rural areas often became cat-and-mouse games, with local communities frequently protecting their moonshiners, who were often neighbors and vital contributors to the local economy. The sweet aroma from these farmhouse secrets was a constant, tangible reminder that the law of the land, however well-intentioned, could not extinguish the deeply ingrained tradition of alcohol, especially when economic hardship provided such a powerful incentive for defiance. The rural landscape, far from being a passive recipient of Prohibition's dictates, became a crucible of ingenious adaptation. The rusty clang of a still, often hidden in plain sight or deep within natural hollows, symbolized not just law-breaking, but a remarkable degree of resourcefulness and engineering prowess born from the economic desperation and cultural defiance that characterized the era. The design and construction of stills during Prohibition underwent a significant evolution. Traditional copper pot stills, once the standard for legitimate distilleries, were expensive and noticeable. Illicit producers, from isolated farmers to organized crime syndicates, turned to readily available and affordable materials. Everything from modified washing machines and pressure cookers to discarded car radiators and plumbing pipes were repurposed to create distillation apparatus. The emphasis was on portability, efficiency, and above all, concealment. Some stills were designed to be quickly disassembled and moved, while others were built into remote caves or camouflaged within dense undergrowth, requiring arduous treks to maintain. These moonshiners and bootleggers developed sophisticated methods to evade detection. They often operated at night, using campfires to heat their stills and relying on the cover of darkness to transport their product. Knowledge of local terrain was paramount, with intricate networks of hidden trails and back roads serving as escape routes. Experts like Professor Daniel Okrent, author of Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, highlight how some of these clandestine distillers became true masters of their craft, developing specialized techniques to filter and age their illicit spirits, often yielding a product far superior to the toxic bathtub gin brewed in urban areas. The ingenuity extended beyond the stills themselves to the entire production process. Waste products from distillation, for example, were often disposed of in ways that would leave no trace or attract suspicion, such as feeding them to livestock or burying them deep underground. Water sources were carefully selected for their purity and proximity, often diverting natural springs to discreet collection points. The silent still, utilizing steam heat to avoid telltale smoke, became a highly coveted technology. This rural ingenuity was a direct response to the economic pressures of Prohibition and the enforcement efforts of federal agents. It wasn't just about breaking the law. For many, it was about survival. The expertise developed in these hidden operations, from the chemistry of distillation to the mechanics of concealment, represented a unique chapter in American folk engineering. It demonstrated that a government regulation could not easily suppress a deeply ingrained cultural practice, especially when combined with a powerful economic incentive. The rusty clang of a still embodied a resilient spirit of independence, a challenge to authority, and an enduring testament to human adaptability, even in the face of legal prohibition. The clandestine distilleries dotting the rural landscape during Prohibition were not a new phenomenon. They were an explosion of a much older tradition. The sharp glint of a copper kettle under the moonlit sky represented the enduring legacy of moonshiners, an intricate subculture deeply woven into the fabric of American history, whose practices were revitalized and redefined by the era of the Volstead Act. Moonshining, the illicit distillation of alcohol, predates Prohibition by centuries, tracing its roots to early European settlers and blossoming in the American colonies as a means of generating income and preserving grain surpluses. The term itself likely originated from the clandestine nature of its production, often conducted by the light of the moon, to evade excise taxes. Before Prohibition, moonshiners primarily operated in remote, economically marginalized regions, particularly the Appalachian Mountains, where isolation and strong anti-tax sentiments fostered a deep mistrust of external authority. Families passed down recipes, techniques, and the locations of hidden stills through generations, creating a rich oral tradition and a fierce pride in their craft. Prohibition, however, dramatically expanded the geographic reach and economic scale of moonshining. Suddenly, the practice was no longer confined to isolated mountain hollows. It became a nationwide industry. Farmers across the country, as we've explored, turned to illegal distilling as a vital source of income. This influx of new producers, alongside the traditional moonshiners, created an enormous supply chain that fed the urban demand for illicit liquor. The legacy of these moonshiners is multifaceted. On one hand, they supplied an essential product to a thirsty nation, often producing spirits of superior quality compared to the adulterated industrial alcohol that circulated. Many of the techniques and recipes refined during this era, particularly for corn whiskey, directly influenced the development of American whiskey's post-prohibition. Indeed, some of today's celebrated craft distillers trace their lineage and knowledge back to these illicit origins. On the other hand, moonshining contributed to the broader breakdown of law and order. While many moonshiners considered themselves simply purveyors of a service, they operated outside the law, often resorting to violence to protect their operations from rivals and federal agents. Their activities also contributed to the negative stereotype of rural communities as backward and lawless. Ultimately, the sharp glint of a copper kettle during Prohibition symbolized both resistance and adaptation. It represented the defiance of a segment of the population against federal decree, an economic lifeline for struggling rural communities, and a crucial link in the vast illegal network that undercut the very foundations of the noble experiment. The moonshiner, an enduring figure in American folklore, found renewed purpose and a broader stage during Prohibition, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's relationship with alcohol and authority. As Prohibition wore on, the initial moral fervor began to wane, replaced by a growing chorus of discontent. This shift wasn't spontaneous. It was nurtured by a burgeoning anti-prohibition movement that adeptly utilized emerging media, particularly the hum of a secret radio broadcast, to rally public opinion, effectively giving voice to the people's growing frustration and dismantling the carefully constructed official narrative. The early years of Prohibition were dominated by pro-temperance messages, often disseminated through churches, schools, and established media. However, as the negative consequences of the ban became undeniable, rising crime, corruption, and economic losses, an opposition movement began to coalesce. Organizations like the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, AAPA, founded in 1918 but gaining significant power in the mid-1920s, became highly effective lobbyists and propagandists for repeal. The AAPA, largely funded by wealthy industrialists who opposed prohibition on economic and libertarian grounds, published extensively researched reports detailing the skyrocketing costs of enforcement, the loss of tax revenue, and the dramatic increase in organized crime. They argued that prohibition was not only ineffective, but actively detrimental to American society. Their reports were meticulously factual, presenting data on crime rates, enforcement budgets, and the economic harm to industries like hospitality and agriculture. Crucially, the rise of radio played a pivotal role in this battle for public opinion. While official government channels were largely silent on the mounting problems, a growing number of independent and often clandestine radio stations began broadcasting content that subtly or overtly challenged the dry law. These wet broadcasts often featured commentators, economists, and even former law enforcement officials who openly criticized prohibition, bypassing traditional censorship and reaching directly into American homes. Imagine the hum of a secret radio broadcast late at night, whispering statistics about crime rates or anecdotes about police corruption, chipping away at the official narrative. This direct access to the public was revolutionary. It allowed proponents of repeal to present their case unfiltered, fostering a sense of shared grievance and solidarity among listeners. These broadcasts weren't just about providing information. They were about creating a counter-narrative, exposing the hypocrisy and practical failures of a law that many felt had overstepped its bounds. The shift in public opinion was palpable. Polls, though rudimentary by today's standards, indicated a significant move from support for prohibition to a growing desire for its repeal by the late 1920s and early 1930s. The battle for prohibition's future was fundamentally a battle of information and persuasion. While the government struggled to maintain its moral authority in the face of rampant law-breaking, the anti-prohibition movement skillfully leveraged data, personal narratives, and the power of new media to sway public sentiment. The hum of a secret radio broadcast became a powerful symbol of the people's voice, growing louder and more insistent, until it could no longer be ignored, setting the stage for the ultimate demise of the noble experiment. While prohibition cast a long shadow over American society, it also inadvertently shone a harsh, revealing light on the intricate, pervasive corruption that festered beneath the surface of officialdom. The soft glow of a hidden lamp in a backroom deal, or the sudden glare of flashbulbs on a high-profile bust, collectively illuminated the underworld's deep entanglement with law enforcement and politics, exposing a systemic decay that deeply eroded public trust. The astronomical profits generated by illegal alcohol created an irresistible incentive for corruption at nearly every level of government and law enforcement. From the beat cop on the street to federal agents and even high-ranking political officials, the temptation for bribery and complicity was immense. Historians estimate that, in some cities, up to 80% of local police forces were on the payroll of bootleggers and organized crime syndicates. This widespread corruption meant that enforcement of prohibition was, at best, inconsistent, and at worst, a tool for criminal enterprises to eliminate rivals by sicking compromised authorities on them. Consider the pervasive system of protection money. A speakeasy owner, rather than risk a raid, would simply pay a regular fee to local police or corrupt federal agents. This payment ensured an unmolested operation, a clear example of the law being selectively applied for profit. In larger cities, organized crime syndicates often had entire districts or precincts under their control. In Chicago, for instance, Al Capone's empire was notorious for its ability to bribe officials, from precinct captains to judges, creating what amounted to a functional parallel government that operated outside and often above the law. This corruption extended into the higher echelons of politics. Politicians, beholden to criminal organizations for campaign donations and sometimes even muscle, either turned a blind eye to violations or actively protected illicit operations. This erosion of public trust was profoundly damaging. When citizens witnessed local officials openly ignoring or even facilitating criminal activity, it fundamentally undermined their faith in democratic institutions and the rule of law. The perception grew that justice was not blind, but bought. The Tammany Hall political machine in New York City, long a symbol of urban corruption, found new avenues for graft through prohibition, bribery scandals were not uncommon, some leading to high-profile trials, though many officials continued to operate with impunity. The illumination provided by the soft glow of a hidden lamp was not a romantic one, but a stark, often cynical revelation of the dark underbelly of the noble experiment. It became clear that prohibition, rather than purifying society, had instead injected a potent toxin of corruption into the body politic. This pervasive rot, fueled by the vast sums generated by illegal alcohol, became one of the most damning indictments against the 18th Amendment, demonstrating how a law intended to uplift morality instead facilitated its systematic breakdown. The dazzling profits of the illegal liquor trade didn't just enrich gangsters, they also corrupted the very institutions designed to uphold the law. The weight of a full wallet, often filled with illicit gains, became a powerful and insidious force, profoundly compromising law enforcement agencies from the lowest ranks to surprising heights, effectively turning guardians of justice into participants in the crime wave. Federal records and historical accounts paint a stark picture. The Prohibition Bureau, responsible for enforcing the Volstead Act, was plagued by internal corruption. Agents, often poorly paid and with minimal training, found themselves susceptible to the immense financial incentives offered by bootleggers. A prohibition agent's annual salary might be a few $1,000s, while a successful week of bribes could easily double that. This disparity created constant temptation. In its first decade, over 1,000 agents were fired for corruption, including agents caught selling confiscated liquor, accepting bribes, or even running their own bootlegging operations. But the corruption extended far beyond federal agents. Local police departments, sheriff's offices, and even state patrols were deeply compromised. In many cities, systematic payoffs were a recognized part of the illicit alcohol business. Gangsters would maintain elaborate ledgers detailing payments to officers, precinct captains, and even judges. These payments ensured that raids were either avoided, strategically executed against rivals, or conducted as mere publicity stunts without actual intent to prosecute. In a chilling example from Chicago, Al Capone's organization boasted a weekly payroll of $250,000 dedicated solely to bribing officials. The consequences of this pervasive corruption were multifaceted. First, it rendered effective enforcement virtually impossible. Law enforcement, divided by internal corruption and external pressure, could not present a united front against organized crime. Second, it profoundly eroded public trust. When people saw police officers protecting speakeasies or turning a blind eye to illegal activities, their respect for the law and those who enforced it plummeted. This fostered a cynical view of authority and encouraged a culture of defiance, where breaking the law was not only common, but often seen as victimless or even justified. Furthermore, the corruption empowered criminal organizations. By effectively buying protection, gangs could operate with minimal risk, focusing their energies on expanding their empires and eliminating rivals rather than evading genuine law enforcement efforts. The money used for bribes was essentially an investment, ensuring business continuity and allowing for even greater profits. The weight of a full wallet became a symbol not of earned success, but of systemic failure, demonstrating how prohibition, far from curbing vice, actively fostered an environment where corruption flourished, compromising the integrity of America's legal framework for generations. While many Prohibition-era speakeasies were humble, dimly lit affairs designed for discreet, quick consumption, a distinct and often opulent category emerged for the elite, These exclusive establishments, where the crisp sound of cracking ice in a crystal glass underscored sophisticated indulgence, were a stark counterpoint to the moralizing rhetoric of prohibition, revealing how the wealthy navigated and ultimately subverted the law. These elite speakeasies, often located in fashionable neighborhoods or discreetly behind respectable storefronts, catered to the affluent. They presented themselves as refined clubs, luxurious restaurants, or even private residences, effectively masking their illicit operations. Unlike their working-class counterparts, which might be a single clandestine room, these high-end venues often featured multiple floors, elaborate bars, dance floors with live jazz orchestras, and even gourmet kitchens. The decor was often lavish, replicating the grandeur of pre-prohibition European-style salons or fashionable New York supper clubs. Access to these exclusive establishments was highly controlled. Membership might require personal referrals, hefty fees, or a known social standing. The secrecy was not just about evading the law, but also about maintaining an aura of exclusivity and prestige. Once inside, patrons could expect top-shelf liquor, often smuggled from Canada or Europe, ensuring a quality and safety that was a world away from the dangerous bathtub gin found in less reputable establishments. The prices, accordingly, were exorbitant, further cementing their status as playgrounds for the wealthy. Consider the legendary 21 Club in New York City, which began as a speakeasy known as the Puncheon Club, and later Jack and Charlie's 21. It featured secret wine cellars, a disappearing bar, and a sophisticated alarm system to dump bottles into the city sewers during a raid. Its clientele included politicians, Broadway stars, and captains of industry, all enjoying high-quality illicit alcohol in an environment of carefully managed discretion. These establishments thrived precisely because their powerful patrons ensured they largely remained unmolested by law enforcement, thanks to bribery and political influence. The existence and proliferation of these elite speakeasies highlighted a profound class disparity in the enforcement of prohibition. While working-class citizens might face arrest and harsh penalties for minor alcohol-related infractions, the wealthy could continue to enjoy fine spirits and lavish entertainment with relative impunity. This blatant hypocrisy further fueled public resentment and distrust towards the law. The crisp sound of cracking ice in a martini glass for the privileged was a sharp contrast to the silent, desperate consumption of potentially toxic concoctions by others, underscoring how prohibition, intended as a universal moral good, instead exacerbated social inequalities and exposed the deeply flawed nature of its implementation across the American social spectrum. Prohibition's most damaging legacy, beyond the rise of organized crime and the poisoned alcohol, may well have been its profound and lasting corrosive effect on the American justice system. The heavy silence in a courtroom, meant to signify the solemnity of law, too often instead echoed with the chilling sounds of injustice, hypocrisy, and a system buckling under the weight of an unenforceable law. The sheer volume of prohibition-related offences overwhelmed federal and local courts. Before 1919, federal courts handled a relatively small number of cases. By the mid-1920s, prohibition cases constituted over 60% of the federal criminal docket. This explosion in caseload led to severe backlogs, hasty trials, and an overall degradation of judicial efficiency. Judges were often forced to streamline proceedings, which could compromise due process. The focus shifted from meticulous legal argument to simply clearing dockets, often resulting in plea bargains that favored neither justice nor effective deterrence. Moreover, the discretion given to local and federal agents in enforcement led to stark inequalities in how the law was applied. Working-class individuals, immigrants, and minorities were disproportionately targeted and convicted, filling jails and prisons. In contrast, the wealthy and well-connected often escaped with little more than a slap on the wrist, or their cases were dismissed altogether through legal maneuvering or outright bribery. This two-tiered system of justice chipped away at the underlying principle of equality before the law, breeding cynicism and resentment amongst the general populace. The very nature of prohibition offences also stretched legal definitions and procedures regarding search and seizure, wiretapping, and due process. Law enforcement agencies, desperate to catch illicit operators, often pushed the boundaries of legal conduct, leading to a host of civil liberties violations that would have long-term implications for American jurisprudence. The public was increasingly faced with the choice between upholding an unpopular and seemingly unenforceable law, or protecting constitutional rights. Perhaps most damaging was the widespread witness tampering and perjury. Because criminal organizations were so deeply embedded and wielded so much power through intimidation and bribery, it became exceedingly difficult to secure convictions against major figures. Witnesses disappeared, retracted statements, or simply refused to testify, leading to acquittals that further solidified the perception of a broken and corrupt system. For example, during Al Capone's reign in Chicago, only a handful of his associates were ever successfully prosecuted for prohibition violations, while many faced charges for more minor infractions like tax evasion. Ultimately, the heavy silence in a courtroom, meant for justice, was frequently punctuated by the unsettling knowledge that the scales were often tipped against fairness. Prohibition did not just fail to achieve its social goals, it actively undermined the integrity of the American legal system, leaving a legacy of distrust and procedural challenges that would take decades to address. The noble experiment proved to be a harsh lesson in the limits of legislative power and a potent reminder of how readily justice can be compromised by an unpopular and unenforceable law. Prohibition transformed the American coastline and borders into a porous frontier, a vast network of entry points for illegal liquor. The dank smell of a waterfront warehouse, often filled with crates of illicit spirits, became a poignant counterpoint to the dry pronouncements emanating from Washington, revealing the complex international smuggling routes that rendered the noble experiment utterly unenforceable. The sheer scale of demand for alcohol in the United States, coupled with its ready availability in neighboring countries, created an irresistible economic pull for smuggling operations. Canada, with its established distilleries, became a primary source for high-quality whiskey. Mexico supplied various spirits, and the Caribbean islands, particularly the Bahamas, served as crucial transshipment points for British and French liquors. This vast, geographically diverse supply chain proved to be an insurmountable challenge for American law enforcement. One of the most iconic smuggling phenomena was Rum Row. This was a floating liquor store established just outside the 3-mile, later 12-mile territorial limit of U.S. waters. Large freighters, laden with alcohol from Europe and the Caribbean, would anchor offshore, effectively creating an international marketplace. From these motherships, smaller, faster contact boats, known as rum runners, would ferry the liquor to shore under the cover of darkness. Key coastal cities like New York, Boston, and Miami became major hubs for these maritime operations, with specific bays and inlets becoming notorious landing spots for illicit goods. Land routes were equally critical. The 4,000-mile border with Canada was notoriously difficult to patrol. Specially modified cars and trucks, some equipped with false bottoms or secret compartments, ferried Canadian whiskey across. Detroit, directly across the river from Windsor, Ontario, became a central conduit. It's estimated that 75% of illegal liquor entering the US from Canada passed through this area, often transported across the Detroit River by boat during warmer months, or even by sleigh and car over the frozen river in winter. The enforcement efforts against these international smuggling routes were largely insufficient. The Coast Guard and Prohibition Bureau were chronically understaffed and lacked the necessary resources to police such extensive borders and coastlines effectively. Furthermore, the corruption that plagued domestic enforcement also extended to border officials. The vast profits, a case of Canadian whiskey bought for $25, could sell for $200 in New York City, provided irresistible temptation for bribing officials. The dank smell of a waterfront warehouse symbolized not just the ingenuity of smugglers, but the fundamental flaw in a law that sought to defy economic realities and geographic proximity, leading directly to a vast and uncontrollable international criminal enterprise that ultimately doomed prohibition to failure. The vast American coastline, stretching for thousands of miles along the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts, found itself transformed into a sprawling clandestine highway for illegal spirits. The splash of seawater against a hull in the dead of night became the telltale sign of rum running, an audacious and dangerous enterprise that highlighted the sheer futility of trying to legislate America's thirst away. Rum running, a term that broadly encompassed the maritime smuggling of all types of alcoholic beverages, became a highly organized and lucrative industry during Prohibition. The primary battleground was the Atlantic seaboard, particularly from the New England states down to Florida. Large cargo ships, often flying foreign flags, would anchor just outside U.S. territorial waters, typically 3 miles offshore, creating what was infamously known as Rum Row. These motherships, laden with hundreds, sometimes thousands of cases of Scotch, Irish whiskey, Canadian rye, and Caribbean rum, became offshore liquor stores operating with practical impunity from U.S. law. From Rum Row, a fleet of smaller, faster vessels, termed contact boats or rum runners, would dart to shore under the cover of darkness. These were often purpose-built speedboats, fishing trawlers, or modified pleasure yachts designed to outrun the ill-equipped U.S. Coast Guard and Customs Patrol. Drivers often navigated treacherous inlets, hidden coves, and shifting sandbars, relying on intimate knowledge of the local waterways and the element of surprise. The speed and maneuverability of these boats were paramount, as a successful run could make a crew thousands of dollars in a single night. The Caribbean served as a crucial supply hub, with the Bahamas becoming particularly notorious. Nassau, for example, saw its legitimate alcohol exports skyrocket, mainly destined for the thirsty US market. Similarly, the French islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, off the coast of Newfoundland, became a major transshipment point for European spirits. These foreign territories, outside US jurisdiction, facilitated the flow of alcohol, creating a complex international supply chain that stretched across oceans. Enforcement against rum running proved incredibly difficult, almost Sisyphean. The Coast Guard, responsible for patrolling such an immense coastline, was severely underfunded and outmatched by the smugglers' superior vessels and sophisticated networks. While they made numerous seizures and arrests, these were often a drop in the ocean compared to the volume of liquor successfully delivered. The profits were simply too immense, and the risks, for many, worth taking. The romance of the sea, the thrill of the chase, and the promise of untold riches fueled a generation of maritime adventurers and outlaws. The splash of seawater against a hull was more than just a sound. It was a constant, defiant refusal to acknowledge the dry laws of the land, a testament to the unyielding power of demand against the futility of enforced moral abstinence. While the criminal underworld capitalized on prohibition, other industries, completely unrelated to alcohol, also experienced an unexpected boom. Amidst the chaos of bootlegging and speakeasies, the sticky sweetness of a soda fountain emerged as a legitimate and thriving social hub, illustrating how consumer habits shifted and new markets rapidly expanded in response to the absence of legal alcohol. With the closure of thousands of saloons and the sharp decline in legal alcohol production, a significant void was created in the American beverage market and social landscape. Enter the soft drink industry, poised to fill this gap. Companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and Dr. Pepper, already established, saw their sales skyrocket during the Prohibition years. Coca-Cola's sales, for instance, doubled between 1919 and 1929, largely propelled by the absence of beer and other alcoholic alternatives. The soda fountain, once a relatively minor feature of drugstores and confectionaries, underwent a transformation. It evolved into a legitimate and highly popular alternative to the saloon, particularly for young people and families. These establishments offered a wide array of sweet, non-alcoholic beverages, ice cream sodas, milkshakes, and light fare. They provided a respectable, brightly lit, and legal public space for socializing, contrasting sharply with the dim, illicit atmosphere of a speakeasy. This surge in non-alcoholic beverage consumption was a direct, albeit unintended, consequence of prohibition. Consumers still sought enjoyable beverages and places to gather, and the soft drink industry was quick to provide accessible, affordable, and legal options. The cultural shift was profound. From a nation that traditionally consumed copious amounts of beer and spirits, America became a nation increasingly accustomed to the sweet, fizzy taste of carbonated drinks. This period cemented the soft drink as a staple of American culture, a legacy that continues to this day. Furthermore, the expansion of the soft drink industry also indirectly supported other sectors. The demand for sugar, flavors, and bottling equipment naturally increased, providing economic activity in a period where other industries were struggling due to the ban on alcohol. The marketing and distribution networks for soft drinks also became more sophisticated, laying groundwork for future consumer goods industries. The sticky sweetness of a soda fountain serves as a fascinating footnote in the history of prohibition. It demonstrates that even a grand social experiment like the 18th Amendment had far-reaching and often surprising effects on the broader consumer market. While one industry was forcibly suppressed, another flourished, reshaping American tastes and social habits in ways that endured long after the noble experiment ultimately failed. Prohibition's impact extended beyond what people drank. It subtly reshaped how they socialized and entertained themselves. While much attention rightly focuses on the illicit activities spurred by the ban, it also indirectly fostered the growth of new, vibrant forms of legal leisure. The subtle scent of perfume in a brightly lit dance hall became a hallmark of this shifting cultural landscape, revealing a society actively seeking alternative avenues for recreation and social interaction. With the closure of saloons and the clandestine nature of speakeasies, the need for public, respectable entertainment venues became more pronounced. This vacuum contributed significantly to the rise of commercial dance halls, movie theaters, and sports events. Dance halls in particular experienced a heyday, evolving from relatively informal gatherings to large, well-organized establishments that attracted vast crowds. They offered live music, often jazz or swing, and provided a dynamic space for young men and women to socialize, dance, and express a new sense of freedom that was characteristic of the Roaring Twenties. The absence of legal alcohol in these venues paradoxically led to their greater acceptance among a broader segment of the population, including families and women who might have previously shunned the saloon environment. Dance halls and movie palaces provided wholesome alternatives where people could gather and enjoy themselves without the overt presence of alcohol, at least officially. However, it's important to note that many patrons would sneak in flasks of illicit liquor, demonstrating that even in these legal spaces, the spirit of defiance often permeated. The rise of the cinema and spectator sports also played a crucial role in providing new forms of escapism and entertainment. Movies, with their flickering images and narratives of adventure and romance, offered a cheap and accessible form of leisure. Attendance at baseball games and other sporting events soared, providing communal experiences that transcended the class and ethnic divides often associated with saloons. These shifts profoundly impacted social norms. The dance hall, in particular, facilitated a more public mixing of sexes and challenged traditional courtship rituals. Women, empowered by new freedoms and fashions, found social agency in these spaces. The subtle scent of perfume, often denoting a woman's presence, speaks to this integration and the breaking down of gendered social barriers that were a holdover from the previous century. Prohibition, therefore, sparked a reallocation of leisure time and spending. While designed to improve moral rectitude by eliminating alcohol, it indirectly fostered a booming entertainment industry that catered to a public eager for recreation. These new forms of leisure filled a social need, creating cultural spaces where people could gather, commune, and escape the growing pressures and hypocrisies of a nation living under a dry law. The transformation of leisure during this era underscores the adaptability of society and the complex, often unintended consequences of sweeping social legislation. In a nation where the sale and manufacture of alcohol were illegal, ingenuity became a necessity, particularly for those determined to quench the pervasive thirst. The rough texture of homemade labels, hastily pasted onto bottles of illicit spirits, speaks volumes about the art of disguise that permeated every level of Prohibition-era society, from the bootlegger to the average citizen seeking a drink. The key to navigating the strictures of Prohibition was often simple misdirection. Bootleggers, home distillers, and even consumers developed elaborate strategies to conceal alcohol from prying eyes. For bootleggers, this meant transforming their products into seemingly innocuous items. Whiskey might be bottled in containers disguised as medicinal tonic, toilet water, or even cleaning fluid. Labels were often crudely printed or handwritten, sometimes with misspellings or fanciful claims, adding to their amateur charm and functional deception. These false fronts were not just for individual bottles. Entire operations were masked. Breweries might claim to be producing near beer, containing less than 0.5% alcohol, while simultaneously diverting higher proof product. Distilleries sometimes operated under the guise of producing industrial chemicals, or even denatured alcohol, which could then be illegally redistilled. This art of disguise extended to the consumer. Patrons entering speakeasies often carried hip flasks discreetly filled with their own liquor. Women wore corsets with hidden pockets, or specially designed garter flasks to hold small amounts of spirits. The very clothing of the era, the looser silhouettes of the flapper dress, ironically facilitated the concealment of a flask or two. The act of drinking itself became a performance of discretion. Cocktails were often served in teacups, coffee mugs, or other ordinary vessels to avoid suspicion. Even the transportation of alcohol involved elaborate subterfuge. Modified automobiles, with false floors and specialized compartments, were a common sight for bootleggers. However, ordinary citizens also became adept at concealing their purchases. A bottle might be wrapped in newspaper, tucked into a grocery bag, or hidden in a baby carriage. The simple act of obtaining and consuming alcohol became a small act of rebellion, fostering a widespread culture of deception and subterfuge. The rough texture of homemade labels, therefore, symbolizes more than just illegal trade. It represents a pervasive adaptation to an unenforceable law, an everyday act of defiance that blurred the lines between legality and illegality. This collective ingenuity, born of a thirst that legislation could not extinguish, not only sustained the illicit alcohol trade, but also fostered a widespread disregard for the letter of the law, making it an almost theatrical charade. The art of disguise, honed during Prohibition, proved to be a powerful and persistent force undermining the noble experiment. The pervasive culture of disguise and subterfuge, fostered by Prohibition, found its most iconic expression in the physical spaces of illicit activity. The hollow sound of a knock on a back door, followed by a whispered password, became the universal ritual marking secret entryways into the hidden world of speakeasies, a world designed to meticulously separate legal appearances from illicit realities. Speakeasies, by their very definition, operated in secrecy. Unlike the open and public saloons of the pre-Prohibition era, these establishments were designed to blend seamlessly into the urban and rural landscape. They were rarely advertised openly, and their entrances were often deliberately obscured. A common tactic was to establish a speakeasy behind a seemingly legitimate business front. A tailor shop, a bakery, a hardware store, or even a funeral parlor. Customers would enter the legitimate business, perhaps state a code word or make a specific purchase, and then be ushered through a camouflage door, down a flight of stairs, or into a back room where the real activity took place. Consider the meticulous design of these secret entryways. Doors were often reinforced with heavy steel to repel raiders, and many featured sliding peepholes or small grates through which bouncers could vet potential patrons. Intricate alarm systems, sometimes connected to bottles on the bar that would be summarily destroyed upon a raid, were common. False walls, rotating bookshelves, and secret passages were not simply literary tropes, but practical features of many larger, more sophisticated speakeasies, allowing for quick concealment of liquor or discreet escapes. These secret entryways served several crucial functions. Firstly, they provided a layer of protection against police raids, making it harder for law enforcement to prove illegal activity without a search warrant, which could be difficult to obtain. Secondly, the ritual of gaining entry, the knock, the password, the vetting, added to the allure and mystique of the speakeasy. It transformed the act of drinking into an exclusive, almost conspiratorial experience, a shared secret among those who defied the dry laws. This increased the thrill and psychological appeal of these establishments. Moreover, these hidden entryways reinforced the widespread disregard for the law. The constant performance of subterfuge, the knowledge that alcohol was being consumed just behind an ordinary storefront, ingrained a sense of hypocrisy and made a mockery of federal legislation. For many citizens, navigating these secret passages became an almost mundane part of their social lives, further normalizing illegal activity. The hollow sound of a knock on a back door, therefore, was more than just a means of entry. It was a potent symbol of Prohibition's failure. It represented the collective ingenuity of a nation determined to drink, the fundamental futility of enforcing a law against popular will, and the deep cracks that had formed in the social contract. These secret entryways were a physical manifestation of a society that had learned to live in the shadows, navigating a world where legality and reality were constantly at odds. Beyond the tangible consequences of crime and corruption, Prohibition exacted a more subtle yet profound toll on the American psyche. The fading memory of a pleasant buzz and the enforced, often hypocritical abstinence from alcohol led to a complex psychological impact, altering societal norms, individual behaviors, and the very perception of personal freedom. Initially, Prohibitionists envisioned a moral regeneration, a society purified of the perceived evils of drink. They believed crime, poverty, and domestic abuse would plummet. While some official statistics did show a temporary drop in alcohol-related arrests and deaths in the very early years, these numbers were quickly overshadowed by contrary trends and the emergence of unforeseen psychological effects. For instance, while public drunkenness might have decreased, private consumption often increased, shifting the problem from observable public spaces into the home. The concept of forbidden fruit played a powerful psychological role. Human nature often dictates that to forbid something is to make it more desirable. Alcohol, previously an ordinary social lubricant, now carried an illicit thrill. This added allure, coupled with the rebellious spirit of the Roaring Twenties, meant that abstaining from alcohol was often seen as old-fashioned, while drinking became a symbol of modernity and defiance. This psychological flip increased the desirability of the forbidden beverage, especially among younger generations who actively sought to differentiate themselves from the sensibilities of their parents. Moreover, the quality and type of alcohol consumed underwent a significant change. With legitimate breweries and distilleries closed, quality control vanished. The widespread availability of potent, often dangerous spirits, from moonshine to redistilled industrial alcohol, meant that when people did drink, they were often consuming beverages with much higher alcohol content than before Prohibition. This shift naturally led to quicker and more extreme intoxication, potentially fostering more severe alcohol-related problems among those who continued to drink. The gentle social buzz often associated with moderate consumption faded, replaced by the desire for a potent, fast-acting high. The pervasive illegality also fostered a broader sense of cynicism and disregard for the law. When a significant portion of the population actively engaged in or condoned illegal activity, the moral authority of the government diminished. This erosion of respect for legal authority had a lasting psychological impact, fostering a culture where bending or breaking rules for personal gain became more normalized. Public opinion polls, nascent though they were, increasingly showed a population weary of federal overreach and disillusioned with the perceived moral failures of Prohibition. The fading memory of a pleasant buzz, replaced by the anxieties of illicit consumption or the hollow feeling of forced abstinence, underscored a critical psychological miscalculation. Prohibition failed to understand human behavior and the limitations of legislating morality. Instead of creating a more virtuous society, it inadvertently incentivized rebellion, fostered dangerous drinking habits, and eroded the very trust in institutions it was designed to uphold, leaving a complex and troubling psychological legacy. The abrupt arrival of Prohibition decimated a once thriving industry, leaving thousands of bartenders, brewers, and distillers unemployed overnight. Yet, amidst the economic fallout, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. The resilient spirit of the bartender, adapting, innovating, and surviving by transforming from legitimate server to illicit mixologist, demonstrating an enduring human adaptability in the face of restrictive laws. Before Prohibition, the bartender was a respected, if sometimes morally ambiguous, figure in society. Saloons were places of central social importance, and the bartender was often a pillar of the community, a confidant, and an expert in his craft. When the Volstead Act came into force, an estimated 200,000 saloon workers, predominantly bartenders, lost their jobs. This was a massive economic displacement, particularly for a workforce heavily composed of immigrants and working-class men. However, the demand for alcohol, far from disappearing, simply moved underground. Many former bartenders possessing invaluable skills in mixing drinks, understanding liquor, and managing a bar, found themselves in high demand in the burgeoning world of speakeasies. Their expertise was crucial for several reasons. Firstly, they understood how to stretch and mask the taste of often inferior quality illicit alcohol. Bathtub gin, moonshine, and rough spirits required creative doctoring with mixers, juices, and syrups to make them palatable. This gave rise to the golden age of the cocktail, with drinks like the Bee's Knees, the South Side, and the Mary Pickford becoming popular, specifically designed to disguise the harshness of the available liquor. Secondly, bartenders understood the social dynamics of a bar. They knew how to manage a crowd, identify potential trouble, and enforce discretion. In the inherently illegal environment of a speakeasy, these skills were vital for maintaining secrecy and minimizing the risk of raids. Their ability to foster a sense of conviviality and trust was essential for attracting and retaining clientele in a competitive and dangerous market. Moreover, many bartenders themselves became entrepreneurs, setting up their own speakeasies or private clubs, leveraging their networks and knowledge of the trade. Some even dabbled in bootlegging, expanding their roles beyond simply serving drinks to actively supplying them. Legendary figures like Texas Guinan, a flamboyant New York City speakeasy owner, exemplified this transition, transforming from entertainer to an iconic hostess and businesswoman in the illicit world. The resilient spirit of the bartender during Prohibition was a testament to human ingenuity and economic necessity. They navigated a treacherous landscape, turning their skills into a means of survival, and in doing so, they also inadvertently shaped the future of mixology. The period fostered an era of unprecedented cocktail innovation, practices that would eventually re-emerge and become celebrated in the post-Prohibition cocktail scene. The bartender, once a public figure, retreated into the shadows, only to return with a newly honed craft, confirming that even the most restrictive laws could not extinguish a deeply ingrained cultural practice and the people who mastered its art. As the illicit flow of alcohol breached America's borders, the response from federal authorities escalated, leading to a militarization of border enforcement unseen before. The harsh glare of a searchlight sweeping across a dark river or a desolate stretch of desert became a ubiquitous symbol of the desperate pursuit to stem the tide of contraband, fundamentally reshaping the role and capabilities of agencies like the Border Patrol. Prior to Prohibition, border security was a relatively modest affair, primarily concerned with customs duties and immigration. The 18th Amendment transformed this. Suddenly, The entire land and maritime borders became critical fronts in the war on booze. The challenge was immense. A 4,000-mile border with Canada, a 2,000-mile border with Mexico, and thousands of miles of coastline. The existing agencies were woefully unprepared for the scale of this new task. The U.S. Border Patrol, established in 1924, found its nascent mission significantly shaped by Prohibition. Before its formal creation, disparate agencies had limited jurisdiction and resources. The Border Patrol was created, in part, to address the influx of both illegal immigrants and smuggled goods, with alcohol quickly becoming a top priority. Agents were deployed along the land borders, often in remote and dangerous areas, tasked with intercepting bootleggers crossing in modified vehicles, on horseback, or even on foot. These agents, often armed and operating with limited backup, frequently engaged in dangerous chases and confrontations. The Coast Guard, responsible for maritime enforcement, faced an even more formidable challenge. As discussed in Chapter 11, the vastness of Rum Row and the speed of rum runner boats often outmatched their capabilities. The Coast Guard was forced to upgrade its fleet, acquiring faster patrol boats and even early aircraft for surveillance. The searchlight, cutting through the night, became an iconic tool in their relentless, often frustrating pursuit of elusive smugglers along the coast. However, despite these efforts, enforcement was consistently hampered by a lack of resources, corruption, and the sheer ingenuity of bootleggers. The scale of smuggling was simply too vast. It was an economic battle where bootleggers, fueled by astronomical profits, could always outspend and often out-innovate the government. For every successful seizure, countless other shipments slipped through. The Border Patrol's early years were characterized by a constant struggle against overwhelming odds, a battle that often felt unwinnable. The harsh glare of a searchlight thus came to represent not just law enforcement's resolve, but also the Sisyphean task they faced. Prohibition dramatically expanded the reach and the militarization of border security, laying foundational policies and infrastructure that would persist long after the repeal. It solidified the image of the border as a contested zone and demonstrated the immense difficulty and human cost of attempting to enforce an unpopular law against the powerful forces of supply and demand, inadvertently shaping modern border management for decades to come. While urban centers wrestled with speakeasies and gang warfare, and coastlines buzzed with rum runners, the backbone of America, its agricultural sector, felt the silent, pervasive sting of Prohibition's economic fallout. The whispering wind through empty fields and the struggling farm towns bore witness to the often overlooked economic strain on farmers, ironically the very bedrock of many temperance movements. At the onset of Prohibition, many farmers, particularly those involved in the Anti-Saloon League, largely supported the ban, believing it would lead to a more virtuous and prosperous society. What they failed to anticipate, however, was the profound economic impact on agricultural markets. The sudden outlawing of alcohol production devastated industries that relied heavily on grains and fruits. Brewers, distillers, and wineries ceased operations, abruptly cutting off a huge demand for crops like corn, rye, barley, hops, and grapes. For instance, the brewing industry alone consumed enormous quantities of grain. With its collapse, grain prices plummeted, dealing a severe blow to farmers already navigating a challenging post-World War I economic environment. Grape growers, particularly in California where a nascent wine industry was flourishing, faced financial ruin. While the Volstead Act did permit the home production of up to 200 gallons of non-intoxicating fruit juice, often winked at for winemaking purposes, this loophole did not compensate for the loss of commercial markets. Prices for Concord grapes, favored for homemade sacramental or fruit juice, artificially inflated, but many varietals used for commercial wine became worthless. Thousands of acres of vineyards were either ripped out or converted to other, less profitable crops. Furthermore, the loss of tax revenue from alcohol sales at both federal and state levels placed additional burdens on local economies. Property taxes or other levies often had to increase to compensate for shortfalls, further squeezing farmers and rural communities. Banks that had lent money to legitimate agricultural enterprises connected to the alcohol industry faced defaults, contributing to the broader financial instability that would eventually lead to the Great Depression. Some farmers, desperate to make ends meet, turned to illicit alcohol production, fueling the rise of moonshining. While this provided a temporary, dangerous income for some, it was often accompanied by the risk of arrest and the inherent dangers of producing unregulated alcohol. It also fundamentally eroded the social fabric in communities where formerly law-abiding citizens were now engaged in criminal activity simply to survive. The whispering wind through empty fields, once rustling with profitable crops, became a symbol of missed opportunity and economic hardship. Prohibition, intended to elevate moral standards, had inadvertently sabotaged a significant portion of the agricultural economy, demonstrating how a singular focus on moral objectives, without considering broader economic consequences, could trigger a cascade of unintended and damaging social effects. The farmers, who once championed the ban, found themselves among its most significant economic casualties. Prohibition's removal of the traditional saloon from the public landscape created a significant void, not just for alcohol consumption, but for everyday social interaction. In the wake of this change, entirely new public spaces, often characterized by the rich aroma of hidden coffee shops and cafes, rose to prominence, testifying to the human need for communal gathering and the adaptability of urban culture. Before the 18th Amendment, saloons served as critical social hubs for working-class men, offering inexpensive drinks, rudimentary meals, and important social functions like community meetings, job information exchanges, and even banking services. The closure of these establishments, while celebrated by temperance advocates, left millions without their usual place of casual congregation. This void was partly filled by the black market speakeasies, but these were often secretive, costly, and carried the risk of arrest. Into this gap stepped new types of legitimate, alcohol-free public spaces. Soda fountains, as we've explored, became popular oases for families and young people. Similarly, independent coffee shops, lunch counters, and cafes experienced a renaissance. These establishments offered an open, legal, and often lively alternative for people seeking social connection, a quick meal, or just a place to read a newspaper. They welcomed a broader clientele, including women, who had largely been excluded from saloons. The rich aroma of coffee and baked goods replaced the smell of stale beer, fostering a different kind of public conviviality. These alternative spaces played a vital, if often overlooked, role in maintaining social cohesion during a period of immense societal change. They became casual meeting points for business and leisure, places where information was exchanged and friendships were forged, without the overt presence of illegal alcohol. The rise of these establishments also reflected broader demographic and cultural shifts, such as the increasing independence of women and the burgeoning urban middle class seeking respectable, modern forms of entertainment and dining. Many such establishments, evolving from simple lunch counters, laid the groundwork for the modern diner and casual restaurant culture that would flourish in post-Prohibition America. The success of these entirely legal enterprises underscored a fundamental truth. Human beings are social creatures seeking common ground and places to gather. While Prohibition attempted to dictate what people could not consume, it could not extinguish the underlying human need for public spaces and shared experiences. The rich aroma of hidden coffee shops and the bustling atmosphere of soda fountains served as a powerful reminder that culture, when faced with restriction, does not simply disappear, but reshapes itself, finding new, often unexpected avenues for expression and congregation. These institutions became unintended beneficiaries of the noble experiment, creating a lasting legacy in America's social and culinary landscape long after the ban on alcohol was lifted. Prohibition, intended to enforce a strict moral code, paradoxically ignited a period of unprecedented cultural rebellion and artistic dynamism. The vibrant hues of a new art movement, echoing the restless energy of the era, swept across America, reflecting a society determined to express itself freely, often in direct defiance of the dry laws that sought to constrain it. The 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, were a time of rapid social transformation. Post-World War I, disillusionment, coupled with technological advancements like radio and cinema, fueled a desire for novelty and breaking with tradition. Prohibition, by making drinking an act of rebellion, only intensified this cultural shift. It inadvertently fostered an environment where pushing boundaries, not just in consumption but in art, music, and literature, became a symbol of modernity and individual freedom. Jazz, born in the melting pot of New Orleans, exploded into national prominence during Prohibition. Its improvisational, syncopated rhythms and rebellious spirit perfectly captured the zeitgeist. Speakeasies, both large and small, became primary venues for jazz performances, offering employment to musicians and introducing new audiences to the genre. Figures like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith rose to iconic status, their music becoming the soundtrack to an era of defiance and experimentation. This was music that challenged racial and class barriers, bringing together diverse audiences in the shared pursuit of illicit pleasure. Literature also experienced a profound shift. Writers of the lost generation, such as F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, frequently explored themes of disillusionment, moral decay, and hedonism, often with alcohol playing a central role in their narratives. Works like Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby vividly painted a picture of widespread social drinking and moral ambiguity, reflecting the reality of the era rather than the dry ideal. These literary figures, often expatriates, critiqued American society, highlighting the hypocrisy and social tensions exacerbated by Prohibition. The visual arts, too, saw experimentation, reflecting the fast pace and changing values of the era. Art Deco, with its sleek lines and modern aesthetic, symbolized progress and luxury, often found in the design of speakeasies and the opulent homes of the newly wealthy, whether legally or illegally acquired. The vibrant hues of a new art movement, jazz, flapper fashion, and groundbreaking literature all coalesced into a powerful expression of cultural dissent. This cultural rebellion, often fueled by the illicit freedoms found in speakeasies, became a profound critique of Prohibition itself. It demonstrated that attempts to legislate morality could not contain the human spirit's desire for expression, entertainment, and a different kind of social order. Prohibition, in its rigid attempt to control, paradoxically unleashed a cultural explosion that forever changed the face of American art and society. Beyond the economic and social realignments, Prohibition inadvertently tapped into a powerful psychological phenomenon: the allure of the forbidden, the tang of fear and anticipation, a subtle undercurrent to every illicit sip, transformed drinking from a mundane act into a thrilling, rebellious experience, highlighting a critical human element missed by the architects of the noble experiment. Before 1920, alcohol was an openly available commodity, its consumption largely unremarkable within established social norms. With its sudden legal prohibition, however, the act of drinking became infused with new meaning. It was an act of defiance, a subtle challenge to authority, and a participation in a shared secret. This transformation from ordinary to illicit created an inherent appeal, particularly for young people and those seeking to express independence from established moral codes. Psychologically, the element of risk heightened the pleasure. Every secret knock on a speakeasy door, every hushed conversation about a bootlegger's latest supply, every glance over the shoulder added a frisson of excitement that legitimate drinking never possessed. This cocktail of fear and anticipation amplified the perceived enjoyment of the forbidden fruit. Sociologists and historians describe this as the forbidden fruit effect, where an object or activity becomes more attractive simply because it is prohibited. This thrill transcended class and gender. For the flapper, embracing the illicit act of drinking in a speakeasy was a tangible expression of newfound freedom and modernity, a rejection of Victorian-era prudishness. For the working man, it might be a subtle act of rebellion against perceived government overreach. For the wealthy elite, it added an exclusive edge to their already privileged lives, a private club where rules were flaunted. It created a sense of shared transgression, fostering a strong bond among those who participated in the underground culture. The very quality of the drink often mattered less than the act of consuming it. Bathtub gin and moonshine, frequently harsh and even dangerous, were consumed with gusto, the perceived pleasure enhanced by the rebellious context. The elaborate rituals of gaining entry to speakeasies, the code words, and the hidden entrances further formalized this sense of thrilling secrecy, making the experience more akin to belonging to an exclusive club than simply ordering a drink. The tang of fear and anticipation, therefore, became an invisible ingredient in every illicit cocktail. It demonstrated that attempts to legislate morality, when lacking widespread public consent, could inadvertently create a powerful counterculture, paradoxically making the prohibited item more desirable. Prohibition failed to account for this fundamental aspect of human psychology, proving that sometimes the surest way to encourage an activity is to outright forbid it, elevating it from the mundane to the irresistibly thrilling. Beneath the surface glamour of the Roaring Twenties and the thrills of illicit indulgence, Prohibition left a more enduring and damaging legacy, a deepening social divide. The lingering taste of bitterness, born from perceived hypocrisy and unfair application of the law, etched scars onto the fabric of American society, exacerbating existing tensions and creating new ones that would take decades to heal. Prohibition, far from uniting the nation in a common moral cause, splintered it further along existing fault lines of class, ethnicity, and geography. The early support for the 18th Amendment often came from rural, Protestant, and middle-class communities who viewed alcohol as a corrupting influence, tied to urban immigrant populations and working-class saloons. When Prohibition was enacted, these groups expected a nationwide cessation of drinking. However, the reality was starkly different. While saloons were closed, the affluent and well-connected found relatively easy access to high-quality illicit liquor in lavish speakeasies and private clubs. Their money bought protection, discretion, and the best smuggled spirits. For working-class and immigrant communities, access was often limited to dangerous, cheaply made bathtub gin or moonshine, and the threat of arrest was much higher. The hypocrisy was glaring. The wealthy drank champagne, while the poor risked blindness or a jail cell for their beer. This created a profound sense of injustice and resentment, fueling the perception that the law was enforced selectively and unfairly. The social divide was also apparent in the cultural landscape. The flapper culture, with its rebellious drinking and dancing, was largely a phenomenon of the urban middle and upper classes. Many rural and conservative communities viewed this behavior with moral outrage, deepening the cultural chasm between urban and rural America. Prohibition magnified existing cultural conflicts, turning a debate about alcohol into a broader struggle over what kind of society America should be. Furthermore, the very act of enforcing prohibition created animosity between communities and law enforcement. Raids were often seen as an attack on personal liberty, especially in ethnic enclaves where traditional drinking customs were long-standing. This fueled distrust of government and law enforcement, particularly among immigrant groups who already felt marginalized. The social compact, based on shared values and respect for the law, was severely strained. The lingering taste of bitterness from Prohibition's social divisions was a powerful, corrosive force. It demonstrated that laws imposed without broad public consensus and enforced with class and cultural bias would inevitably fail and leave deep-seated resentments. The noble experiment did not purify American society. Instead, it exacerbated its divisions, creating a legacy of distrust and cynicism that would contribute to the political and social unrest of future decades. The scars of this divisive era served as a potent lesson on the complexities of legislating morality and the enduring power of social inequities. The widespread defiance of prohibition was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was a complex, highly organized, and surprisingly efficient system of production, distribution, and sales. The rumbling of a delivery truck at dawn, laden with crates of illicit spirits, symbolized the intricate logistics of illegality that proved far more robust than the government's attempts to enforce a dry America. With the 18th Amendment, legitimate alcohol producers vanished, but the demand for their product did not. This created a vast commercial opportunity that organized crime was uniquely positioned to exploit. The logistics of bootlegging involved sourcing, production, transportation, and retail, each segment meticulously managed. Sourcing involved two primary avenues: smuggling from abroad and illicit domestic production. Smuggling routes, as we've explored, were extensive, bringing in high-quality products from Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Domestically, criminal syndicates operated large-scale illicit distilleries and breweries, often hidden in remote rural areas or disguised within industrial facilities. These operations required consistent supplies of raw materials, sugar, corn, rye, hops, and specialized equipment, all procured through clandestine networks. Transportation was the lifeblood of the bootlegging empire. From coast to coast and across national borders, a sophisticated network of vehicles, vessels, and even early aircraft moved alcohol. Customized trucks and cars, designed for speed and large payloads, were used for overland transport. Maritime operations, from rum row to smaller contact boats, ferried liquor from offshore motherships to secluded coastal landings. These operations required precise timing, coded communications, and the ability to evade law enforcement. Gangs employed skilled drivers, pilots, and boat captains, offering high pay to compensate for the extreme risks. Finally, the retail end of the operation involved a vast network of speakeasies, blind pigs, and individual sellers. Organized crime often owned or controlled these outlets, ensuring a direct and profitable pipeline from production to consumption. This allowed for vertical integration, maximizing profits and control over the entire supply chain. Gangs implemented disciplined distribution schedules, often mimicking legitimate businesses, to ensure a steady flow of product to their clientele. The scale of these operations was immense. For instance, Al Capone's Chicago outfit was estimated to employ thousands of individuals, from distillers and drivers to bartenders and enforcers, mirroring a modern industrial corporation in its structure and efficiency. The profits generated were astronomical, estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, which far outstripped the budget of the Prohibition Bureau. The rumbling of a delivery truck at dawn was more than just a sound of illegal activity. It was a testament to the unforeseen consequences of prohibition. By criminalizing a widespread social custom, the government inadvertently created a massive market for illegal goods, fostering an environment where organized criminal enterprises could not only thrive, but also develop sophisticated industrial-scale logistics operations. This established a precedent for organized crime's involvement in other illicit trades, leaving a lasting mark on American crime and society for decades to come, far beyond the lifespan of the 18th Amendment. Beneath the grand narratives of gangland warfare and political corruption, prohibition profoundly impacted individual lives, forcing countless Americans to make complicated personal choices. The cold metal of a stolen flask, clutched secretly in a pocket or purse, represented not just defiance, but also a complex interplay of personal desire, social pressure, and at times desperation, revealing the intimate costs of a nationwide ban. For many Americans, particularly before Prohibition, alcohol was deeply ingrained in social rituals, family traditions, and daily life. It was consumed moderately at meals, during celebrations, or simply as a means of relaxation after a day's work. The abrupt criminalization of this common practice forced individuals to reassess their relationship with the law and with drinking itself. For those who chose to continue consuming alcohol, it meant embracing a new identity, that of a lawbreaker, even if that law felt arbitrary or unjust. The act of acquiring and consuming alcohol became fraught with personal risk. Attending a speakeasy meant navigating secret entries, constant vigilance for raids, and potentially consuming unsafe liquor. For those who couldn't afford speakeasy prices or preferred the comfort of home brewing or distilling became common. This, however, brought the legal peril directly into the domestic sphere, turning otherwise law-abiding citizens into accidental criminals. The psychological burden of constant secrecy and the fear of exposure, even for minor infractions, weighed heavily on many. Crucially, the unregulated nature of illicit alcohol introduced significant health risks. As discussed, the widespread availability of industrial alcohol, often redistilled imperfectly, led to thousands of cases of blindness, paralysis, and death. Individuals consuming this bathtub gin or raw moonshine were gambling with their health, often out of a mixture of ignorance, addiction, or sheer desperation. The choice to drink became a potentially fatal one, a stark contrast to the regulated products available before the ban. The impact also extended to social dynamics and personal ethics. The culture of subterfuge fostered by prohibition eroded honesty and trust, as individuals learned to lie to authorities, conceal their activities from neighbors, and navigate a world where legal and moral lines blurred. This had a subtle but corrosive effect on interpersonal relationships and community trust. The cold metal of a stolen flask, filled with dubious liquid, is a tangible symbol of these personal choices and the underlying desperation. It represents the individual's quiet struggle against a powerful, yet increasingly unpopular law. It highlights the deeply personal cost of a social experiment that, by attempting to control individual vice, instead forced millions into dangerous, illegal, and often desperate practices, leaving behind a legacy of personal compromises and unintended suffering. Throughout the 1920s, the noble experiment of prohibition gradually unraveled, its failures becoming too glaring to ignore. What began as a confident decree evolved into a nationwide regret, marked by the growing murmur of dissatisfaction that swelled into an undeniable public clamor, ultimately leading to the call for repeal. By the mid-1920s, the initial optimistic predictions of prohibition advocates had demonstrably failed to materialize. Rather than eradicating social ills, the ban on alcohol had inadvertently created or exacerbated a host of new problems. Crime rates, fueled by the immensely profitable illicit liquor trade, soared. Organized crime syndicates flourished, gaining unprecedented power and wealth, and infiltrating every level of government through widespread corruption. The perceived moral uplift was overshadowed by a pervasive sense of lawlessness and hypocrisy. The economic costs also became increasingly apparent. The government was losing massive amounts of tax revenue that had once come from legitimate alcohol sales. Instead, it was spending vast sums on attempting to enforce an unenforceable law, diverting resources from other public services. Industries related to alcohol, like brewing, distilling, and hospitality, had been decimated, leading to significant job losses. This economic drain became particularly acute with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, when the prospect of lost tax revenues and potential job creation from legal alcohol became critically attractive. Perhaps most significant was the profound shift in public opinion. Initial support for prohibition, fueled by moral arguments and wartime patriotism, began to erode as the realities set in. Organizations like the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, AAPA, comprised of influential industrialists and politicians, began to effectively articulate the case for repeal. They pointed to the rising crime rates, the rampant judicial and police corruption, and the loss of personal liberty. Newspapers and the burgeoning radio industry provided platforms for these arguments, reaching a wider audience than ever before. Women, long a driving force behind temperance, also began to turn against prohibition in increasing numbers. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, WONPA, founded in 1929 by Pauline Sabin, argued that prohibition was failing to protect families, instead fostering crime and disrespect for the law among children. Their voices, representing a powerful demographic, greatly amplified the call for repeal. By the late 1920s, polls indicated that a clear majority of Americans favored either modification or outright repeal of the 18th Amendment. The growing murmur of dissatisfaction was thus not just a collection of individual complaints. It was a coalescing national rejection of an experiment that had gone terribly wrong. It was a recognition that the noble experiment had failed on nearly every metric it had set for itself, and in doing so, had inflicted severe and lasting damage on the fabric of American society. This collective realization set the stage for a monumental constitutional change, signaling the beginning of the end for the Great Dry Delusion. The pursuit of a teetotaling America, born of an idealistic vision, ultimately crumbled under the crushing weight of failed policy. Prohibition, envisioned as a moral triumph, instead became a human disaster, its unintended consequences far outweighing any perceived benefits, leaving a profound and often tragic mark on countless lives. The human cost of prohibition was devastating and multifaceted. Perhaps most directly, thousands lost their lives due to the consumption of unregulated toxic alcohol. As we explored with industrial alcohol, the government's own policy of denaturing alcohol led to an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 deaths from poisoning. Many more suffered blindness, paralysis, and permanent organ damage from moonshine or bathtub gin produced with dangerous impurities. The ideal of a healthier society was tragically subverted by the reality of a poisoned populace. Beyond immediate physical harm, prohibition fostered a widespread disregard for law and order. It transformed ordinary citizens into criminals, filling jails and burdening the judicial system. The sheer volume of violations meant that many citizens, previously law-abiding, now participated in illegal acts, a phenomenon that eroded respect for legal authority and facilitated a cynical view of government. This moral decay, where police and politicians were routinely bribed and justice was often bought, had a corrosive effect on the nation's integrity, leaving deep scars on its social fabric. The economic costs were also immense, disproportionately affecting the working class and rural communities. Legitimate industries tied to alcohol were decimated, leading to massive unemployment. Farmers, who once supplied grains to breweries, faced financial ruin. This economic instability contributed directly to the hardship experienced by many families, particularly as the nation entered the Great Depression in the waning years of Prohibition. Perhaps the most insidious human cost was the empowerment of organized crime. Prohibition handed criminal syndicates, previously fragmented and relatively small, an unparalleled financial opportunity. The vast profits from bootlegging allowed figures like Al Capone to build empires of intimidation, violence, and corruption. The increase in gang violence, urban warfare, and the systematic corruption of public officials left a lasting legacy of criminal enterprise in America that far outlived the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was an ambitious, well-intentioned ideal ultimately crushed by the reality of human nature, economic forces, and deeply flawed policy implementation. It stands as a stark historical warning. Laws, no matter how morally righteous their stated aims, must reckon with their practical consequences and the profound, often tragic, human costs they can inflict when detached from the nuanced complexities of society. The noble experiment was a disaster because it prioritized an unattainable moral purity over the tangible well-being, trust, and even lives of its citizens. The growing murmur of dissatisfaction, the crushing weight of failed policy, and the undeniable human cost coalesced into an irresistible force. After nearly 15 years of this noble experiment, America was ready to admit defeat. On December 5, 1933, the ratification of the 21st Amendment brought an end to an era, and with it, the sweet symphony of a legal cork pop heralded the return of alcohol and a nation's collective sigh of relief. The movement for repeal gained significant momentum in the early 1930s, accelerated by the Great Depression. the economic arguments against prohibition became overwhelmingly compelling. Legalizing alcohol promised billions in much-needed tax revenue, which could help fund government programs and stimulate a struggling economy. Furthermore, the prospect of creating thousands of jobs in brewing, distilling, distribution, and hospitality industries offered a glimmer of hope during widespread unemployment. Organizations like the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, AAPA, and the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, NNPR, tirelessly campaigned, highlighting the policy's failures, the rise of organized crime, widespread corruption, and the general disrespect for the law it engendered. Political will began to shift dramatically. The Democratic Party platform in 1932 explicitly called for repeal, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, campaigning on this promise, won the presidency in a landslide. It became clear that the public sentiment had overwhelmingly turned against prohibition. Congress quickly passed the 21st Amendment, which directly repealed the 18th Amendment, making it the first and only time in American history that an amendment has been repealed. The process of ratification was swift, bypassing state legislatures and going directly to state conventions, demonstrating the urgency of the matter. On December 5, 1933, Utah became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, reaching the necessary 3/4 majority. The news spread like wildfire across the nation. Celebrations erupted spontaneously, with people pouring into the streets, raising toasts, and reveling in their newfound freedom. Breweries, which had been operating under stringent restrictions or illegally, immediately began to ramp up production. The sweet symphony of a legal cork pop that resonated nationwide on that historic day was more than just a celebratory sound. It was the resounding declaration of prohibition's failure. It marked the end of a grand social experiment that, despite its high-minded intentions, had proven to be disastrous on almost every front. The repeal was a pragmatic response to a policy that had inadvertently poisoned its citizens, empowered criminals, corrupted institutions, and eroded the very moral and social fabric it aimed to strengthen. The nation learned a harsh yet enduring lesson about the limits of legislating morality and the unforeseen consequences of attempting to dictate personal choices through constitutional amendment. The intoxicating scent of newly legal spirits filled the air, marking not just the return of alcohol, but the culmination of a profound national reckoning. While the immediate celebrations were joyous, the lasting aftertaste of the noble experiment was a complex mix of lessons learned and futures forged, permanently altering the American social, political, and criminal landscape. Prohibition left an indelible mark on America. The most immediate lesson was the futility of legislating morality without widespread public consent and the practical capacity for enforcement. It demonstrated that attempts to ban deeply ingrained social customs often lead to unintended and far more destructive consequences, rather than the desired societal purification. The economic arguments for repeal, particularly during the Great Depression, underscored the importance of tax revenue and legitimate industry contributions to national well-being. However, the impacts extended far beyond just the policy of alcohol. Prohibition served as a crucible for organized crime, allowing criminal syndicates to consolidate power, wealth, and expertise in illicit markets. Figures like Al Capone became household names, and the methods they perfected in bootlegging, from complex distribution networks to systematic corruption of officials, laid the groundwork for future criminal enterprises in other illegal trades. This established a precedent for a more sophisticated, violent, and pervasive underworld, that challenged law enforcement for decades. The widespread corruption witnessed during Prohibition also profoundly damaged public trust in government and law enforcement. The spectacle of officials openly taking bribes or selectively enforcing laws bred a deep cynicism that eroded faith in democratic institutions. This lingering distrust often fueled calls for greater accountability and transparency in governance. On the social front, Prohibition permanently altered drinking habits. The pre-Prohibition saloon, a largely male domain, was replaced by the post-Prohibition bar or cocktail lounge, which welcomed women and a more diverse clientele. The popularity of mixed drinks, born out of the necessity to mask the taste of poor-quality illicit alcohol, revolutionized mixology and became a lasting cultural phenomenon. Prohibition inadvertently made drinking more socially acceptable for women, accelerating shifts in gender roles and public behavior. The power of federal government also expanded during Prohibition in an attempt to enforce the federal law, setting precedents for future federal interventions in areas previously considered local or state matters. The tools and agencies developed, such as the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which evolved from the Prohibition Unit, foreshadowed the expansion of federal law enforcement powers. The lasting aftertaste of this national experiment is a cautionary tale, a powerful reminder of the complex interplay between law, morality, and human behavior. It underscored that true societal change cannot be achieved through mere prohibition, but requires a deeper understanding of economic realities, social norms, and the inherent limitations of government power. Prohibition was a disaster for America, but from its wreckage emerged crucial insights into the nature of law, governance, and the resilient, often defiant spirit of a nation.